Hi guys, I'm Kat and welcome back to my channel. So as we all know here, I love urban legends. I love state urban legends, but I also love the classic urban legends. But my favorite urban legends are the ones that kind of are stemmed from real life events, ones that were inspired by real life events, because to me it makes them creepier and a lot more interesting. And the one in particular that I want to talk about is the babysitter urban legend. So, for those of you who might not know what this urban legend is, basically it's the urban legend of a babysitter goes to a house to babysit a family's kids. She's home alone, the kids are asleep, and then she gets a phone call, and the person on the phone keeps asking if she's checked on the children, and then eventually you find out the call is coming from inside the house. It also, I think a lot of the reason why it's creepy is because the thought of someone being in a house when you think that you're alone is terrifying. And I've always found this legend really interesting. But what a lot of people don't know, or at least I don't think they know, is that this legend actually became a thing in the 1960s. But it was actually inspired by a murder that happened in Columbia, Missouri in the 1950s. And that is the murder of Janet Christman. Little PSA, this case does include SA. It does include strangulation, blood, assault, things like that. So if you're someone who's really sensitive to those things, I suggest that you maybe don't watch this video. Janet Christman was a 13-year-old girl that was born in Boonville, Missouri on March 21st, 1936. She was born to Charles and Lula Christman, and she was the oldest of 3 daughters. Charles and Lula decided to move their little family to Missouri, to Columbia, Missouri, so that they could take over Charles's father's business, Ernie's Cafe, I believe it was called. It was Ernie's Cafe and Steakhouse, and they lived in an apartment above the cafe. Janet was said to be a very good kid, that she was very independent and very mature for her age. She went to church, she was very good academically, she could play the piano, and was just a really, really good kid. And on the night of her murder, or night of her murder, the school was throwing a party for the 8th graders and the students, and her friends invited her to go, but she decided not to go because she was going to babysit for a family that she babysat for often, the Romacks. She wanted to get some money because I guess she had wanted to get a burgundy suit that she wanted to wear for Easter, so she needed to get some money to pay for that. Janet knew this family. She had babysat for them before, and she had also babysat for another family called the Muellers. And she arrived at the Romacks at around 7:30. Ed and Anne had greeted her. They brought her inside. The Romacks, I guess, hadn't gone out for a long time. Anne was said to be pregnant at the time, so they didn't really have a lot of time to go out, so they jumped at the chance to go to this event in town and asked Janet to babysit. Anne told Janet that their 3-year-old Gregory liked to sleep with the radio on, so he shouldn't cause her any problems throughout the night and that he should basically sleep throughout the night. Ed had shown Janet how to load and unload and shoot their shotgun, just in case something bad happened. And he also told her if anybody came to the house and knocked on the door to turn on the porch light, and to not answer the door for anybody that she didn't know or recognize, and to lock up the doors so that nobody could get in. After they went through all of this, Anne and Ed left for the event that they were going to. At 10:35 p.m., the Boone Sheriff's Office got a terrified phone call. Officer Ray McCowan answered the call, and it was a woman screaming, "Terrified, come quick." But before this woman could say her name or her location, the phone call cut off, and all they were getting was a dial tone. McCowan said that he knew that the call wasn't a prank because of how terrified her voice was. So he was really concerned. But the problem with it being the 1950s is that the technology to trace a phone call didn't exist. The only thing that they could do was call the phone company to see if maybe they could figure out where the phone call came from, but the place was closed for the night, so there was no one to try to trace this call. So they basically had to wait and see if maybe they'd get a call again. Anne called the home to check into Gregory, but nobody answered. But Anne didn't really feel very concerned because she figured since it's late, Gregory was probably asleep, and so was Janet. So she didn't really take concern to it and just continued at the event. At 1:35 a.m., Ed and Anne returned home, and they found it odd because the porch light was on. And Ed had told Janet to only turn on the porch light if someone came to the house. So he was a little concerned, but didn't really think anything of it until he got to the door to unlock the door, and it was already unlocked, which was really perplexing for him because he had specifically told her to keep the house locked up. But when they walked in, I can only imagine how awful this must have been when they found Janet dead on the living room floor. Janet's body was sprawled on the living room floor, and she was in a puddle of her own blood. She looked like she had been hit by something in the head. She had puncture wounds in her skin, which looked like they could be caused from a mechanical pencil, and she had the snapped off cord of a iron around her neck, like she had been strangled. It also appeared that she had been assaulted because her legs were spread open and there was a shoe dangling on her right foot, barely holding on. When Anne looked over at the phone, you could see that the phone was dangling off the hook, which would explain why when she called, nobody answered. Anne panicked because Janet is dead on the floor, so where is her son? So she ran upstairs to find Gregory, and luckily, Gregory was unharmed, and he was actually still asleep, which is surprising. But like she said, he liked to sleep with the radio on, so he probably didn't hear it. And Ed was downstairs calling the police. Not too long after the call, Glenn Powell of the Boone County Police came to the scene with detectives. So there were some complications from the very beginning of this case with the police force. I guess there was a Lieutenant Douglas from the city police, and he wanted to come and take reign. But since the home was 100 yards out of city limits, he didn't have any jurisdiction. So this caused a lot of problems amongst the departments and amongst the corporations, amongst the agencies, which a lot of answers came to light really quickly, but it also caused complications when it came to the investigation because a lot of the departments, the corporations, the agencies didn't agree with each other, which is really unfortunate, and you'll understand why in the end. As they investigated the scene, they found that it appeared that Janet had tried to fight off her killer, that there were bloody handprints and blood in the kitchen and in the living room and all around the house. The search dogs actually tracked the assailant's scent 1 mile from Stewart Road, which is where the house was, but eventually, sadly, lost the scent and had to come back to the scene. As they investigated the scene further, they found a male footprint near one of the windows on, I believe, the right side of the house, and the window was broken by a gardening hoe, and that's how the police assumed the assailant got into the house, because there was mud on sheet music by the piano and on the ground. So they assumed that's how he got in. But the other agency didn't believe that this was true because they didn't think it made sense. So the other agency didn't really think that he broke into the house via the window. The reason is because the porch light was on. And Ed gave Janet very specific instructions to turn on the porch light if someone approached the door. So the other agency believed that someone that Janet knew came to the door, and since it was someone she knew and someone friendly, she answered the door. And the shotgun was untouched, wasn't even shot off, and the assailant knew where to find the iron to break off the wire to strangle her. And this is where a lot of the conflict came. One side believed that he broke into the house with a gardening hoe, and one side believed that it was an assailant that Janet knew. And my thoughts are that maybe the shotgun wasn't shot off because she didn't have time, but also at the same time, if this was someone friendly that she knew, then he would easily be coming to the house, but how did the window get broken? I don't know. But it said that they worked in 12-hour shifts around the area trying to find this guy, and they believed that he might come back to the area to kind of relish in his accomplishment of what he did, but nobody ever came back to the area. The police questioned family, friends, neighbors, students, and they even asked the public to report anybody that they thought was suspicious or anybody that was acting weird or different that they thought might be the killer. And they did have a lot of people call trying to give them possible leads, but they didn't really get very far. The incident shook Colombia to its core, because it was the very first incident like this that happened since 1946. Is that in 1946, a very similar attack happened to a 20-year-old named Mary Lou. So Mary Lou Jenkins was home alone, and her mother was down the street helping an elderly couple, and her father was doing business, so she was home alone. But her mom and her kind of devised a plan of what they could do if something bad happened. They decided what they were going to do was turn on a light in the house, open the shades, and give a phone call. So that way, they both felt safe. As the night drew on, Mary Lou's mom noticed that there was a light on in the house and that the shades were up. But there was no phone call, so she didn't think anything of it. She thought maybe there was just a shade up and a light in the house because Mary Lou was home. Unfortunately, though, when her mom came back home, she found Mary Lou dead in the living room. She was sprawled on the living room floor. She was in a puddle of her own blood, and it also looked like she was strangled and assaulted, and she had an extension cord wrapped around her neck. Now, something else that's really interesting about this is that Mary Lou Jenkins and her family only lived a mile from the Romack house, which is more than a coincidence in my opinion. A couple weeks after Mary Lou's murder, a 35-year-old man named Floyd, I'm going to say this wrong, Cochran, was arrested because he murdered his wife. And he was questioned for hours and pretty harshly until he confessed that he murdered her. And it was said in the report that he didn't seem remorseful that he murdered his wife. Floyd did confess to the murder, but they had no evidence against him, nothing that proved that he did murder his wife. Floyd was sentenced to death by the gas chamber, but an hour or so before he went into his execution, he took his confession back. He said that the police egged him on and pushed him to confess, but unfortunately, it was too late, and he was executed, and the cops considered Mary Lou's murder solved. Now, a few weeks and months after this, a series of reports of prowlers and peeping toms did start coming in, and assaults did start occurring more often in 1949. The police believed that despite all of these reports of these assaults and these things that were very similar to Mary Lou and Janet's murder, that they had caught the right guy. So they were concerned about it. They didn't see a connection because they believed that they caught him. But after this terrible incident that happened to Janet, a lot of the public kind of doubted the police's competence because it was so incredibly similar. And a lot of people believe that they just decided on Floyd because he was convenient. This was the 1950s as well. And a lot, if you read about it and you see the people that they considered a suspect, you can tell that this was very racially driven. Because a lot of the people they brought in as suspects were black men. But none of the people that they interrogated or brought in had any evidence they had alibis. It was very fruitless. But unfortunately, that happened because it was the 1950s. And because sometimes, and this is just a little bit of shade, but sometimes the police force, if they are desperate to figure out a murder or an incident, they'll pick the person that's the most convenient. As the evidence stacked up, they did start to get a prime subject, or a prime suspect, and his name was Robert Mueller. And remember what I mentioned, that she only babysat for two families, the Romacks and the Muellers? Interesting that. And a lot of the circumstantial evidence kept stacking up and kept pointing at Robert. So Robert was actually friends with Ed. They went to school together, they had been high school buddies. But after Robert graduated, he served in World War II as an Army Air Corps captain. After he graduated, he returned. After he served, he returned to Columbia, Missouri, and he took over his father's cafe and business, and he was also a tailor. It was said that Robert was known for dressing really well, but also that he was known to have a mechanical pencil in his shirt or jacket pocket. Now remember how I said that one of the injuries to Janet's body was puncture wounds because of a mechanical pencil? Again, interesting. But Robert and Ed reconnected and they spent a lot of time together. Robert, according to Ed, had eyes for virginal women. And he had actually told Ed once before that he had a desire, an urge to, I wrote, defile someone young. Janet, like I said before, babysat for the Muellers. And Ed was not necessarily appropriate with Janet, and he would say a lot of inappropriate things, that she was well developed for her age in her hips and her breasts. But unfortunately, Janet wasn't the only subject of his affection, I guess, because he also had a thing for Anne, Ed's wife. She said that he made her very uncomfortable because he'd always have or give sexual advances that she wasn't interested in, and that there was one time he came over to help her hem a dress, and he tried to fondle her breasts. She said that Robert is the kind of man that uses voices, uses words. He uses his hands, which when I wrote that down, it made me feel ooky. It just made me feel like gross. Like, and also, like, what is Ed doing? Does Ed know that Robert is trying to fondle his wife and that he's making her uncomfortable? Or is it just like a thing he doesn't know, like she's keeping it to herself because she doesn't want to cause problems? Or is it just like something Ed doesn't care about? I don't know. But it's gross. But another thing that made the police a little bit suspicious is that the morning of Janet's murder, Robert actually had called Janet to ask her to babysit their son. But Janet declined because she was already set to babysit the Romac's son, so she couldn't. And the reason it made the police suspicious was because that made it so Robert knew where she was. The Romacks and the Muellers went to the same party, the same event, along with some friends, and they were just kind of, living it up, doing their thing. But a few hours into the party, Robert said that he needed to leave for a while because he needed to go speak with his doctor that was tending to their son. But then he came back 2 hours later and just continued to party. When the police questioned their doctor, the doctor said that he never went to the Muellers' house to check on their son, that wasn't true. So the police became even more suspicious. Ed also said that he got a call from Robert the morning of Janet's murder, and he asked them if they would need any help cleaning up the blood throughout the house. But this caused even more suspicion because the knowledge of the murder hadn't been published in newspapers yet. It hadn't even been told yet. The only people that knew were the police, the Romacks, and the Christmans. So how did Robert know that this tragedy happened, and how did he know that there was blood everywhere? But he had also talked to Ed about the murder and how he didn't believe that the assailant broke in through a window because that would just be too loud and that would alert someone into the house. He said it would be easier to go up to the door, knock on it, and say that Ed sent me here to pick up some poker chips. That seems oddly specific to me. The circumstantial evidence just kept stacking up more and more and more. And finally in May, they gathered all the evidence and decided to go to Robert's residence to talk to him. Now, something that I found odd, well, one of the things that I found odd in this case is that they didn't follow the normal procedure of, an arrest warrant, taking him into custody, bringing him to the department, interrogating him, because that's not what they did. They actually took him to a farmhouse outside the city to interrogate him. And then they took him to Jefferson City to get a polygraph test, which Robert passed. So they had to let him go. There was so much evidence, though, pointing at him that Court Judge W.M. Dimwittle, which to me sounds fake, but maybe, decided to arrange a grand jury to investigate the case. There was just so much pointing at him that there was no way it wasn't him. But Robert was never charged because of the incompetence of the police. Probably because these two departments just couldn't get along and couldn't agree. Which is frustrating. And Robert actually tried to sue the police, which it didn't work, but he tried. Robert decided to move his entire family to Tucson, Arizona, and at the age of 83, Robert died. A lot of families actually moved out of Columbia, Missouri after what happened to Janet, probably because they were nervous about what happened and they didn't want their kids to be murdered for obvious reasons. The Romacks moved to Idaho, and Anne died in 1980, and Ed passed in 2016 at the age of 93. Gregory grew up to be very successful, which is awesome. And he probably didn't remember the event because he was only 3 years old. Janet's family, the Christmans, they remained in Columbia and continued to run their cafe until 1974 when Charles died. Lula, Janet's mom, she moved to Kansas City. She lived there until 2009 when she passed away. The Romacks and the Christmans believed 100% that Robert Mueller was responsible for Janet's death. But since the judicial system, the police, and everybody failed to actually create a solid case, they're never going to find out. And unfortunately, everybody that was involved eventually died. So Charles and Lula will never know what really happened to their daughter. Anne and Ed will never know. And Robert died. So we'll never know if he murdered that little girl. What's crazy is it's almost March. And if Janet was still alive, if she didn't die, she would be 86 years old on the 21st. Which is really sad because this little girl was just trying to make her money to pay for her suit that she was trying to get for Easter, and someone terrorized her and then killed her brutally. a 13-year-old girl that hadn't even started her life yet was murdered, probably by someone that she trusted, by some disgusting man. Like, it's awful. Now, you may be wondering what inspired me to talk about this awful case. And it was because I watched When a Stranger Calls today, and it reminded me that the movie was based off the urban legend, and I did remember that I read somewhere that the urban legend was based off an actual murder that occurred. Now, of course, some of it was flourished, made a little more thriller-esque, but I can't imagine what that would be like. That's one of my worst fears, is to be here alone and for someone to be in the house with me. Like, I always check underneath my bed, I check in my closets, because I'm so afraid that someone got into my apartment when I wasn't here. It's terrifying. So I can only imagine. I hate the fact that the last moments of this little girl's life was terror. People suck. So yeah, so that was the murder case that inspired the Babysitter urban legend, which inspires a lot of stories and a lot of movies. And I'm also sorry for all the jump cuts. I like talking about stuff like this. I find it really interesting, but it's difficult for me sometimes to get into the mindset, because it's gonna sound cheesy, but I'm empathic. And when I read cases about people that were murdered in such a way and died in such fear and pain, it's really hard for me to wrap my mind around it and to get past that. And so that's why there's so many jump cuts. And also so I could gather my thoughts, gather myself, read stuff to make sure that I was saying everything that needs to be said. But yeah, so I'm gonna watch a movie that's really cheerful, and I'm gonna eat a snack, and then I'm gonna go to bed. Try to clear out my head from this murder. But people are crazy. But I'm gonna go, and I hope that you have a wonderful day and a beautiful night. Thank you for joining me in this video. If you liked it, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you want to hit subscribe, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification so you can be notified whenever I post. Most of the videos I do here are on creepy, spooky things, occasionally life things, mental health things, and honestly, it's kind of a mixed bag. I've been told I need to pick one specific thing, but it's really hard for me to do that, so I'm sorry. But, you know, I'm here, and I hope that you have a wonderful day and a beautiful night, and that you stay safe out there. And this is Kat, signing off. Bye. Does anybody else turn off their lights and then all they can see is dots for a while? Or is that just me?